to the Ideal Nutrition Podcast. This is episode 33. I am Leah Heigl and I am here with my co-host Aidan Leah. And today we are doing part 2 of non-traditional approaches to type 2 diabetes management. So in part 1, we went over just basic background stuff to kind of set us up for this podcast, but now we're really going to get into the meat of it.
So going straight to business, we're going to go with the most aggressive one. So we're going to go with very low calorie diets. So the biggest study on this one, or the most interesting study at least, is called the Direct trial. So it came out in 2017, which is cool because it also means we have some follow-up data on the study as well. And it was a pretty large trial in that they had around 300 people total, but about 150 or 149 went into the intervention group. And the intervention was basically just over 800 calories per day in the form of shakes for 3 to 5 months. Firstly, just taking a second to let that sink in. And
how aggressive that really is.
I often try and put myself in the shoes of people doing stuff and I'm like, I care a lot about nutrition. And I would find that incredibly hard, even if it was something that would be beneficial for me. So that's obviously hard from the low calorie perspective, but also being you can't really eat out with friends and family and stuff like that for 3 to 5 months while pursuing that approach. So very aggressive, but it's an interesting approach in terms of the outcomes. And one of the things I absolutely loved about that study is that they did what they called a stepped food reintroduction for 2 to 8 weeks after that. So basically they weaned off the low calorie diet, which is not something you would regularly see people do in practice in the real world. As in they did the shakes for 3 to 5 months, then they'd take away one shake and replace it with a meal based on that kind of balance plate model of half plate vegetables, quarter protein, quarter plate carbs. And then after a bit, they took away another shake, added a meal, and then they took away another shake and added a meal. And then they did what they called structured support for long-term weight loss maintenance, which is also a bit of a key part of the study in that it was pretty intense in all aspects in terms of they had a lot of healthcare professionals involved. They had a lot of contact with doctors and dietitians and they had a lot of support, okay? And obviously as it progressed, over the years, they got a lot less support, but particularly early on, they got a lot of support. And their goal was remission based on the criteria we talked about in the previous podcast, except the only difference was they were only measuring it over a 2-month time frame to call it remission, as in they had to be off all of their anti-diabetic medications and have a HbA1c of less than 6.5%, which would classify them as non-diabetic if they were to be tested the first time. Fascinating in that remission was achieved in 46% of the participants in the intervention, compared to the control, which only had 4%.
Yeah, that's just such a huge difference.
Yeah, and that's why it stands out, because it's very, very aggressive approach, but also insanely effective in comparison to a lot of other more common methods, which is why this discussion is really being had, because it kind of needs to be talked about. As we spoke about in the last podcast, or as I mentioned, it's kind of losing a significant amount of body fat is a pretty significant factor in whether or not remission is likely to be achieved. And based on these statistics, just going through it, 76 participants gained weight. So that's something to stand out being they didn't have to follow the diet. You can't gain weight on 800 calories. They didn't have to follow the diet. It obviously shows how hard it is to follow that diet. That means quite a large percentage weren't following the diet, but that also makes it more interesting from a real world setting, because it's kind of what's possible in the real world. We care more about what's possible in the real world than we care about people where all of their food is provided for them for this specific kind of scenario. But out of the 76 participants who gained weight, none of them achieved remission. 7% of the people who lost 0 to 5 kilos and maintained that over the 12 months were in remission. 34% of the people who lost 5 to 10 kilos, 57% of those who lost 10 to 15 kilos, and 86% of the people who lost 15 kilos or more were in complete remission at the end of the 12 months. So it's very, very correlated with the amount of weight that was lost. And just so we know some averages, so in the Direct trial, the average body weight decrease was 10 kilos at the end of the 12 months. And in the control group, the average weight increased by 1 kilo on average. So we've got the comparison of kind of like standard molar care in the UK and the direct trial. They've got 2019 follow-up data, so 2 years after the study, showing that 24% of the intervention group was still down more than 10 kilos. And 64% of those people were still in remission. So that's really interesting as well, because as we talked about with the whole concept of weight regain and stuff like that, almost every study I've ever seen, multiple years down the line, people are regaining weight. Common theme. That's happening in this study still. It's just that 2 years later, there still was a significant amount of people who were in remission and had lost more than 10 kilos and stuff like that as well. So the statistics, I'm not saying they're good. I'm not saying like that's an incredible outcome and stuff like that. But when you do compare to almost all other forms of diabetes remission kind of data without bariatric surgery, because bariatric surgery often leads to quite good outcomes with diabetes, particularly over the 5-year kind of time frame, it is pretty impressive data in comparison to the other options. And just jumping onto another concept as well, there was a 2020 study where they did the same study, pretty much the same study, except they did it with participants who had insulin. So they were insulin dependent type 2 diabetes, so a little bit more progressed, and they got great outcomes as well. The obvious challenge with insulin is that you have to adjust your dosage or stop taking insulin or whatever if you were to do a low calorie diet. Otherwise it'd be hypoglycemia, and that's going to cause other issues, which is why we need like a pretty extensive medical team. So, and one last thing on that is that another interesting thing that this group was particularly passionate about kind of measuring was pancreas size and the fat content of the pancreas. So typically with type 2 diabetes, the pancreas is a little bit smaller and is shaped a little bit differently as well, and typically contains a little bit more fat than a healthy pancreas, so to speak. And what they found in this study is that, or in that direct trial, is that the pancreas size actually increased a little bit and had a tiny bit less fat than it normally would have with people with type 2 diabetes, which is their kind of logic behind being like, not only is this improving insulin sensitivity, it's probably improving the ability of the pancreas to put out insulin as well. What would be the downsides of this approach?
Where do we start? I think that it's the practicality of actually doing a diet like this. So even though potentially great outcomes, you're like, how feasible is this in the real world? And just going back to that statistics on like, is it 76 participants out of the 149 ended up gaining weight?
Yeah.
That's a really big percentage of people of like non-compliance.
Yeah.
To be honest, I'm kind of surprised by the compliance they did end up getting, even though a lot of them were non-compliant. But from what I understand, they were doing a lot of things in this study to follow up with clients, with participants. So I don't know. I think it's one of those things that I've never ever done in real life with clients. But yeah, it's a tough one. It just comes down to the practicality, feasibility.
Exactly. It comes down to practicality. Another difficult thing is you do need the medical team around you for multiple reasons. One of it is, in that study, they stopped all diabetes medications and blood pressure medications.
True.
You can't just do it on a whim, because if you were taking blood pressure medications, you would get low blood pressure and be at risk of passing out and stuff like that. So it's kind of like you need a team around you. And the other factor is, what if you were to try this approach and you could get in and see your GP infrequently, and they adjusted your medication, they were on board, which would obviously, you'd have to get them on board as well.
Yeah.
They discontinued medications or whatever, and you tried it for a couple of days, and then you came to the conclusion that you didn't want to go down that route, because as we kind of said, or as I definitely feel like, it's a very hard thing to do, and it's not appealing. Like, I wouldn't want to be on that low calories for that period of time, me personally. What if I wanted to try it, then came to the conclusion that I was like, oh, I actually don't want to do this. I want to explore other options.
Sucks. I'm going to do something else.
Yeah. Then you'd have to get back onto your medications. Like, it's very hard to do. Like, they were in a great scenario for it, and I'm in the same camp as you, is that I haven't done it with any of my clients. I don't have an interest in doing it with any of my clients, but I do have an interest in watching this space and seeing how it goes.
I think it's like the fact that they got those amazing results is definitely noteworthy, and something that we do it has to be a part of this conversation, particularly in regards to like bariatric surgery and everything like that. Something that I wonder is those 76 participants, did they gain a lot more weight than the control group gained? Like, do you know those statistics?
I don't know those statistics.
That's a bit of a weird one, but I wonder if like trialing a diet like that puts you at risk of like binge eating and gaining more weight than you would if you didn't do anything in the first place, and therefore having a worse outcome.
Yeah.
Random thought, but
mathematically we could figure it out based on some of those stats we went through in terms of because if the average weight loss was 10 kilos in the intervention group, like we could figure it out. But like I agree, because it's like like what does happen with those people? We've talked about like the mental burden and stuff like that. Like even the feeling of failure, so to speak, in terms of like if you've attempted that and then you remain in the study and you're still trying to do what the people are telling you to do, and you stay in and you keep following up with them, that would be a hard thing to go through.
Definitely.
Yeah. Next one, you want to talk about low carb diets?
Yeah, let's get on to low carb diets. So this is definitely, I would still consider this at some points an aggressive approach, but nowhere near as aggressive as the very low calorie approach we've just talked about. So it is probably one of your more popular ones you'd see people take as a non-traditional approach. So obviously low carb diets are going to address that blood glucose level issue while you're on it at least. So less carbs, less glucose, less insulin required. So its mechanism's pretty simple in regards to type 2 diabetes. But the argument that's usually made against low-carb diets is going to be the adherence. So kind of similar to what we talked about with the very low-calorie diets and their low adherence. We see a very similar thing sometimes in very, very low-carb diets. But a study that you've noted here, is it, that the CSIRO, is it a statement?
Yeah, so so they did a low-carb diet study. So they've got their book, the CSIRO low-carb book.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so basically the CSIRO, they did a study where it was a 12-month study. They got people to aim for less than 50 grams of carbs per day to start off with, which arguably could be a ketogenic diet, particularly for people of the size who were in the study. Like it's borderline ketogenic diet. And then increasing to less than 70 grams of carbs per day later on in the study to improve adherence was their kind of thing. Like maybe that's an extra serve of fruit or like toast or something like that. Like it makes it a little bit easier. The interesting thing, because I do agree with you on the adherence thing, but the interesting thing in this study was that their adherence based on their criteria of what it takes to adhere to the study, and I think the average weight loss was somewhere between 5 and 10 kilos. I think it was around 10 kilos. Don't quote me on that one, between 5 and 10 kilos. Their criteria for adherence led to slightly more people in the low carb group sticking to the plan enough to be included as part of the end result than in the lower fat, higher carb in comparison kind of group. They both got good results in the study, like the standard model of care style diet got good results. But the adherence was slightly higher. But there's a few things that, one, mathematically, the numbers don't fully stack up in terms of like if they stuck to the diet 100%, their weight loss actually would have been a little bit more. So we know that adherence still wasn't perfect.
But better than expected.
It stood out to me. That's why I remember this years later because it stood out to me. But the other thing that I've often said to like clients when I've mentioned this study and like mentioned this as an option in lower carb diets, but not necessarily ketogenic for the sake of this kind of discussion, is that they had a book to sell. Like
it's always a little bit of a red flag. Isn't it? Yeah.
Like it is in their interests. Like I'm not being a skeptic or anything like that, but it's like that is an outlier study in terms of compliance. Jumping to ketogenic diets, they have shown great results when adhered to for two obvious reasons. One, as you said, like the mechanism, carbs, glucose, insulin, makes sense. But the adherence rates are quite low, and there is even adherence rates kind of measured for people with type 2 diabetes who would be more motivated to go down that route than the average person who was just looking to lose weight, for example. And it seems like adherence rates are relatively high in those who have epilepsy and those who are athletes who believe that it's going to improve their performance.
Sure.
Those adherence rates are relatively high. For almost every other group, adherence rates are really low.
And I can definitely see why. It's a very difficult thing to follow. And you kind of think, like, what is the impact on that individual's quality of life, like social events, just generally being able to just enjoy food. Like, I can definitely see why people don't want to be on this for a long time. Because going back to remission versus management this is more about management. Like that, this alone without weight loss is not going to put you into remission, actual remission from the disease. So you'd likely, if you're not going to lose weight as well, you'd likely have to do this forever as your management.
Yeah. I suppose that's the second point, that like a ketogenic diet, most people are going to lose weight on that because they're going to go into a calorie deficit.
Yeah.
But like there is that concept, and like touching on that even further is that if you have been low carb for a long period of time, it seems like when you do introduce carbs, you're not as sensitive to insulin as somebody who had the exact same body composition and all other factors being equal, who had slightly more carbs for a significant portion of time. If somebody who'd done a ketogenic diet for a year did an oral glucose tolerance test, it seems like they perform worse on that test than somebody who has all other factors being equal. But yeah, that it's an argument in terms of like people in the low carb diet community talk about this being like, I want to prove I'm in remission. How do I beat the oral glucose tolerance test? And they do talk about being like, okay, well, maybe you should introduce carbs for a little bit before you take the test, basically, just to like perform well on that test. But yeah, interesting topic.
Definitely.
But yeah, as mentioned, like if you like just did low carb, that is for management. If you kept your calories the same and stuff like that, and your body fat and stuff like that didn't decrease, you didn't become more sensitive to insulin. But it is one option that, when adhered to, seems to have good outcomes.
Does quite well, for sure. One of the last things we're going to talk about before we move on to a more broad approach that we'd potentially take is plant-based diets. So, I mean, you'd think that this is something that I've gone down the rabbit hole of, but I actually haven't. So this is kind of the first time that I've gone a little bit down this rabbit hole in terms of using plant-based diets for the management of type 2 diabetes. So there is a 2009 study that did compare a low-fat vegan diet to conventional diabetes management. And on average, like when just talking about weight loss, the people on the low-fat vegan diet lost about 4.4 kilos, whilst the control group lost about 3 kilos. So not a really huge difference in those two groups, just from a weight loss perspective. So it's not a crazy outcome. But the vegan diet did improve the HbA1c more than the control, and dramatically outperformed in terms of cholesterol, which you would expect from a diet so low in saturated fat because it's low in animal products. I think the biggest point to make here is that something like this that is relatively high carb in nature, as a plant-based diet usually is, still provided better results than what most people see, sometimes even with the standard model
attempting
of practice,
to follow
or like even doing a low carb diet at some points. So I just think it just highlights that overly focusing on carbs and low carb is definitely missing the bigger picture. And I think that's probably what comes most from this discussion.
Yeah, and like I'm pretty much just repeating your statement, but exactly that. Like it is like highlighting that if you're overly focusing on carbohydrates, you're missing other aspects as well. Like and I say that because I spend time on Twitter reading like low carb advocates kind of statements, but it's kind of like, if you bought too much into what they're saying, you would think that this higher carbohydrate vegan diet would be a massive step back in the management of diabetes, not an improvement.
Yeah, you would think if it the best case scenario would be that it had no effect at all, that you'd think it would be worse. But that's just not the case, that it in sometimes can actually improve the management of type 2 diabetes. So I think that's very interesting. Yeah,
heaps of things to consider. So then the last thing we'll touch on is what I'd call a broad approach. And some things that like if I had type 2 diabetes, it's like, well, what would I focus on? And I'm going to touch on some things that you can focus on without putting yourself into a box of being like low carb, plant-based, or any kind of box. And like these things are, one, exercise in terms of both building muscle, improving body composition, decreasing body fat, the building muscle and like improving insulin sensitivity and stuff like that, but also actually burning glucose. Like there is a stat out there that's something along the lines of either 10 minutes or 30 minutes. Don't quote me on it because I can't remember which one it is, but it's either 10 minutes or 30 minutes of walking is the equivalent of metformin, which is the first line of diabetes management from a medication standpoint. And that's just because you're burning glucose as you're walking. And like when I say in the equivalent of metformin, I mean the equivalent of metformin in terms of like what would happen to your blood glucose levels and HbA1c and everything like that. So like that's just 10 or 30 minutes of walking. What if you did more exercise than that? Like there's a lot of factors to consider. And I often do wonder if, say it's 10 minutes, just to keep this simple, if people were posed 10 minutes of exercise or first line medication for diabetes, which one would you prefer? I feel like a lot of people might choose the 10 minutes of exercise. Not 100% sure on that, but like I feel like it's worth being aware that that's something to consider. It is a factor. Another point that I go with personally is calorie deficit until as lean as desired. That's a bit of a nuanced one because it's kind of like you could even be in the healthy BMI range, but still benefit from getting slightly leaner in terms of insulin sensitivity. That doesn't make it a great idea for all other variables in life and whatever, but purely from a diabetes management perspective, that could be something that could help. So like me personally, I would do the calorie deficit approach. Another variable is keeping protein relatively high, partly from the muscle mass perspective and insulin sensitivity, but also the appetite management perspective and stuff like that too. And also even keeping calories high enough for what I wanted without having to rely on carbohydrates or going excessively high fat. In my case, that would be a personal preference. Another one is keeping fiber high, regardless of the style of diet chosen, even if it's low carb, whether it's plant-based, whether it's whatever, keeping fiber relatively high is going to be a useful thing. That's even something that you can think of in terms of being similar to going low glycemic, because it's kind of like it slows down the absorption of the carbohydrates and how quickly they turn into glucose in the blood. And as another general thing, I would avoid going overly high in carbs, particularly in any individual occasion, meal, snack, or whatever. Even though I personally would still like a flexible approach, I'd still avoid going overly high in any individual occasion, and probably avoiding or limiting, reducing particularly high glycemic index carbohydrates. And all of those things can be done within the context of pretty much any approach, basically.
This has been episode 33 of the Ideal Nutrition Podcast. Thank you for tuning in.